Hello, this is Jacqueline from Jack Knits, and I wanted to quickly share with you a project that I just completed that was so much fun to make. It is a beautiful, colorful baby blanket, and I used up all my scrap yarn to create this beautiful one-of-a-kind blanket. So I'm going to show you exactly how I did this. It's a great project for beginners or for those that just want to use up all that extra yarn you have on hand. So let's get started. All right, so let's get started on knitting this really fun baby blanket using up your scrap yarn for your project. So let's first talk about the yarn that I chose to work with for this project. Again, I went into my yarn stash and I just picked out just a bunch of fun baby colors, some bright colors, a lot of neutral colors to really combine to make this wonderful, colorful blanket. All of my yarn is either a worsted weight yarn or slightly lighter than a worsted weight yarn, so either a 3 or a 4 scale on the yarn weight scale on your skeins of yarn. And then I think all of these yarns are an acrylic blend of some sort, so it can be easily washed for babies. And then I decided to use 2 strands of yarn together to knit my blanket. So I would take both strands, hold them together, and make for a little bit thicker weight blanket by combining 2 strands of yarn together. And I'll show you how to hold that yarn to do that. It's not difficult to do, and that just also provided a much more colorful mix of yarn for the blanket as well. So we held 2 yarns together that made for a little bit thicker yarn, and then I chose to use a number US 10 size needle. I had a long circular needle here that I used so I would hold all my stitches for the blanket. So you'll need some kind of a longer needle. US size 10 is the size I chose. Okay, so let's take a look at the type of stitches that I chose to do for this blanket. I just chose 2 different stitches to use. I did a garter stitch and then a seed stitch. So the garter stitch I did for 3 rows, and that is just knitting every row, knitting every stitch every row for 3 complete rows. Then I switched to a seed stitch, which is basically just a knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1 across 1 row. And then on the other side, you do just the opposite. So when you run across a purl bump, you would knit that stitch. When you run across a knitted V stitch on the one side, you would purl that stitch. And I'll show you that as well, that seed stitch. But again, and I did that, that seed stitch for 5 rows. But you can, of course, choose any type of stitch that you think would look pretty for a blanket and come up with your own design. These are just the 2 stitches I thought were very simple to do, and they made for a nice texture and pretty much completely reversible as well. Okay, so the reason I chose to do each of these stitch sequences for an odd number rows, the garter stitch for 3 rows and the seed stitch for 5, is that I wanted the tails of my yarn at the beginning and the end of those rows to end up on opposite sides. So I had tails on this side, and then I also had tails on this side, and that way I was able to use those tails to create a really fun fringe for the edge of my blanket. So that is also completely optional. You don't have to use fringe. If you'd rather just have a smooth edge blanket, that's fine. You would just have to weave in your ends when you are done. I'm kind of lazy. I didn't really want to weave in my ends, so that's why I thought, oh, I'll just use those tails to add some fringe. Now I added some extra fringe to the project when I was done because I thought it was a little skimpy on the fringe, so I just chose, you know, the colors that were near that spot on the blanket and added some more fringe. You can do that as well if you'd like. Okay, so now let's talk about the dimensions. This particular blanket ended up being 32 inches wide and 35 inches long. The 32 inches wide, I cast it on 100 stitches to get that width. You can make it narrow if you want, just reduce the number of stitches and you will be fine. And then just knit as long as you like or till you run out of yarn, you know, whatever comes first. All right, well, let's get started. I'm just going to show you how I did this blanket with the stitches and holding the yarn together, and we're just going to do a little small swatch together, and then you can see exactly how the construction of this blanket goes. All right, well, let's start with a little swatch to learn how to do this blanket. So you just start by just choosing any two colors yarn that you'd like to start with. I'm going to choose these two shades of pink to start with my very first set of rows of stitches. And my very first set of rows is going to be a garter stitch, but of course first we have to cast on. So I'm going to, as mentioned, I'm going to hold these two strands of yarns together, and I'm just going to work these stitches and knit as if I am just using one strand, but I'm just going to always have these two strands together. So just treat them as one yarn, but know that they're two are going to be together. So I'm going to do the long tail cast on method, and I'm just going to cast on a few stitches just to get us started with a swatch here. And again, just hold these two yarns together. Make sure you're always grabbing both of those yarns when you cast on and when you knit. You don't want one yarn to get left behind. Okay, so that's good enough just for our little swatch here. We've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 stitches. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to knit our first couple rows, and the first set of stitch we're going to do is that garter stitch. So that is just knitting every single row, and every stitch we're going to be doing the knit stitch. So let's just grab our working yarn here. Don't grab the tail. And again, we're just going to make sure that we're always using those both strands together, and we're just going to start by knitting across the row. So we're going to just knit every stitch. And make sure you're knitting both of those strands together and pulling both strands together. Just kind of keep an eye on that. Make sure you don't just accidentally pick up one, but that you're picking up both of those strands. And let's knit to the end of this row. All right, and then we're just going to do that exact same row 2 more times for a total of 3 rows, and then we'll switch to the seed stitch. So let me just work ahead here, and I'll do 2 more rows, and then we'll switch colors. Okay, so now we have completed 3 rows of knitting, and I've got my tail from the start on one end, and I've ended up with the working yarn on the other end that's going to create the tail on the opposite end that we're going to use for the fringe. So at this point, you can just cut that yarn, and just make sure you give it a nice long cut, because you want enough tail to make sure that you're got your fringe the right length. All right, so now we can the fun part is to choose the next color, right? So now we're going to go switch to the seed stitch, and we need 2 more colors of yarn. So let's get rid of this pink here, and maybe let's choose these 2 colors of blue, a little variegated yarn and a pretty blue, and that will be our next color combination. So let's take both of the yarns again and hold 2 strands together. And how I like to join a new color is I like to wrap the working yarn around my pinky, and that kind of gives it some stability. And then we can just simply start knitting our next row, and we are going to do the seed stitch. Now the seed stitch is a knit 1, purl 1 sequence all the way across. So let's start this row by knitting 1, and again this is with our new color sequence, yarns held together. So that's a knit stitch. This is a little loosey-goosey stitch, but you can always pull that pink yarn, that first yarn, after a little bit, and pull that a little tighter, but it will be a little bit loose to start. That's okay. Then the next stitch is going to be a purl stitch. So we'll purl the next stitch, making sure we are always grabbing both of those strands of yarn. Then we'll go to a knit stitch, switch to purl, every other one, knit, purl, knit, and purl, and we'll do this to the end of the row, and then I'll show you what the sequence is on the way back. Okay, we are ending here with a purl stitch at the end of the row. Now we're going to turn our work, and we are going to continue the other side, but now we are going to do the exact opposite of what we did going forward. So here you can see that you've got the V stitch kind of facing you, and you know that that is a knit stitch facing you. So that stitch I'm going to purl. I'm going to do the exact opposite. This one here, I'm seeing a purl bump, so that stitch I'm going to knit. And that's how you're going to know what the sequence is on that returning row. So this first one, again, I mentioned it needs to be a purl stitch. We're doing the opposite of what you see. So purling that first stitch now, and we're going to knit this stitch because we see a purl bump there. And now we're going to purl. So now we're just going on your way, every other one, doing the opposite of what you see. That's a knit stitch, so I'm going to purl it. This is a purl bump, so I'm going to knit it, and we'll do that till the end of this row. Okay, getting to the end, and you can see that this last stitch is kind of gotten really loose, but just pull that yarn from the previous row to get it a little bit tighter. We're going to end with a knit stitch here. Again, just continue to pull those ends a little bit tighter as you go, and then you can continue with row number 3. And again, we're going to do the opposite. So here you can see that it's a purl bump at the very end, which means we're going to start with a knit stitch. Now we see that this is a knit stitch. You see the V, so that means we got to purl the stitch. And now knit, purl, knit, purl, and that is the seed stitch. Makes for a really pretty kind of almost checkerboardy type stitch. So we're going to do the seed stitch for a total of 5 rows, and that's going to complete this color section, and then we'll switch to another color and do the garter stitch again. Okay, when you've completed 5 rows of the seed stitch in that color sequence, we're ready to switch colors again. So again, give yourself a little bit of a tail, clip the color that you just got done knitting, set those 2 colors aside, and let's pick out some new colors. So let's maybe this time just use a nice subtle 2 tones of gray for our next series of stitches, which are going to be garter stitch again. So let's get our yarn to 2 strands together again. And we're going to, again, wrap that yarn around our finger to give it some stability. Switch over to this side, and now we're just going to start to do our garter stitch again, which is knitting every row and knitting every stitch. So we're going to just start with our knit stitch. And again, that stitch is loose, but don't worry, because you can kind of tighten it up as you go. That first stitch and last stitch of those rows. Here's another knit stitch, and we're just going to knit across again for 3 complete rows. Okay, I've did 3 rows of the garter stitch, and now we're going to then switch over to seed stitch. So again, cut your yarn, and you're just going to continue in this fashion. 3 rows of garter stitch, 5 rows of seed stitch, alternating your colors, holding 2 color yarns together at a time. So let me just do a couple more color sections, and then we'll finish off this little swatch binding off, and then we'll talk a little bit about the fringe and how to finish that up as well. All right, so I did a couple more little color sequences here, ending with a garter stitch row. So let's just pretend that this is the end of my blanket and we want to bind off now. So after you've done your 3 rows of garter stitch, you're going to want to end on the garter stitch pattern as your edge of your blanket. Now we will bind off. So this is how we are going to do just a very simple bind off, the very basic one. We're just going to knit 1 stitch here, then knit a 2nd stitch, and then pass that first stitch over that 2nd stitch for the bind off. And you're just going to want to make sure too that you're binding off fairly loosely. You don't want that bind off edge to kind of pull in together. If you do that too tight, you want it to kind of match your stitches in your pattern. So let's bind off the rest of this row, and then we'll talk a little bit about finishing up that fringe. All right, that is our last stitch to bind off. So now we are going to cut ourselves a nice long tail and pull that through. Okay, so now our edge is bound off and we are finished with the blanket part, and now we might want to focus a little bit on this fringe here. So what I did for my fringe, whenever I had two sets of colors together between these two rows, I just did a simple tying a double knot of these two strands or two color strands together, and that just secured those ends to the edge of your project, and that's all you really need to do other than trim it off to whatever desired length you have. But if you're like me and you thought that this amount of fringe is a little skimpy, you might want to add some additional fringe here like I did. And to do that, we're just going to take a crochet hook and add some additional fringe here. So let's say we wanted to fill in this gap here with some green and white yarn that I did for this color sequence. So just grab another scrap strand of these two yarns together, and we are going to just take our crochet hook in the middle of our strands when we fold them in half, and just kind of go through that last stitch there on the end of the blanket. Grab those two strands, pull it through, and then we're going to wrap all four of those strands around your crochet hook and pull it through those two together, then pull the rest of it through. So now you've kind of added another little strand of fringe. And then when you've done that for all your little gaps, here we might add some gray, here we might add another pink strand, till you've got enough fringe that you're comfortable with. Then you can just measure it out. I did my fringe for 3 inches. Just measure 3 inches with a yardstick or measuring tape, and then just trim off your fringe to end it. So that is it. That is a very simple way to use up your scrap yarn, make a beautiful, colorful blanket. And of course, you don't have to make a baby blanket with this. You can make a full-size blanket with other color yarns that is appropriate for adults as well. So do whatever you like. This blanket can be uniquely yours, and you can change things up with the colors, with the stitch, the size, anything you'd like. So give it a try. It's really a fun project. If you like this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe. You'll get lots of videos all about knitting tips and tutorials. So thanks for watching, everyone. Happy knitting.